Everyone is in. So we are live now. Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome everyone who's joining us today for Raising a Series A. We're so excited to have you here with us. We're going to give everyone about a minute or so to log in. But as you are logging in, please share your information, share where you're from, what you do in the chat. It's always great to see who's in the room with us. For yourselves and also for our speakers, we love to see who's with us. And again, we'll give everyone about a minute or so to log in. So welcome, welcome. I see people trickling in. Well, we're so excited to have you join us. Again, as you trickle in, make sure that you are able to introduce yourselves in the chat. We always love to see who's in the room with us, name, where you work or what you do. If you're a founder, what company you're founding. It's always great to see and hear who's in the room with us. And we'll give everyone another minute or so. All right. All right, so we see people as you're trickling in again, please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. We're going to get started. So welcome from Allraise. So excited to have you all here. Again, please introduce yourselves in the chat function. We'd love to see who's in the room with us. I'm Marian Arake, and I support the events for Allraise. And as some of you may know, we are a nonprofit dedicated to amplifying female voices, accelerating female success, and creating a tech culture where women are leading, shaping, and funding the future. And our events and volunteers who make them possible are key to building and amplifying this movement. And so we're really excited to just quickly thank our partners in the work that we do. It's just so important for us to make sure that we highlight them. And before we get started, I'm just going to go over a few housekeeping rules. As many of you may know, this is a webinar, so there's a chat function. So again, please use it to introduce yourselves on the call. If you have a question for our panelists as we do start, please put it in the Q&A box. Both myself and Denise will keep an eye on that and make sure we get to your questions. This session will be recorded and will be published about 48 hours after the event. So definitely keep your eyes open for the webinar recording on our website. And just to go over the agenda for today, we're going to do quick intros. We're going to do about 40 minutes of questions with our panelists today, and we'll leave some time at the end for Q&A. And before we get started, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Make sure all of you can see our panelists, and there's a quick poll. We always love to see who is in the room with us. So if you could please fill out the poll. The first one is who's in the room. We want to know if you're a founder, operator, or investor, and then also share what stage of funding you're in. We always love to see, are you gearing up for pre-seed? Are you pre-seed, seed, gearing up for Series A, or currently raising a Series A? That will be very helpful as we kind of gauge the rest of the conversation. And I'll give you all about 10 more seconds. Thank you all for those who are taking the poll, and we'll have 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, ending poll and sharing results. So we have about 90% of the room are founders with 9% investors. And we have most of the room, 58% are gearing up for a Series A, 30% gearing up for a seed, and 12% gearing up for pre-seed. So I hope that's helpful for our panelists today. And without further ado, it's my pleasure to kick it over to Denise, who will be moderating our session today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Marian, for hosting this, and also really excited to see, it looks like there is a variety of people in the room who are at different stages of their raising. So really excited. Just to start, I will be introducing myself, and then I'll have each panelist will introduce themselves, and then we'll just kick off with some questions. So just as a quick introduction, my name is Denise, spelled like Denise, and I am the co-founder and COO of 5 to 9. We're a platform that enables organizers to basically track, manage, and evaluate their events and programs. This is everything from employee resource group events, socials, manager trainings. And so my company just finished raising its seed round last year in 2020, and we're gearing up for our Series A. So this conversation, I am also going to be learning today. So I'm very excited to hear from people who've already started the experience themselves, and also for some of our panelists, they've been there, done that. So this will be a really fun filled conversation. So I'll kick it off to Kerrigan to introduce herself, and then Carolyn.
Hi, thank you for having me, and really excited to meet you all today. I'm Kerrigan Behrens. I am one of the founders and the co-CEO of Sagely Naturals. We started our CBD business in 2015. So at that point, fewer than 1% of Americans had heard of CBD. Now, obviously, it's become quite a trend. But because we were early, we focused on a very particular demographic, have always been consumer insights led, and with our brand at the heart of what we do, have been able to capture quite a bit of distribution. So we're now available in over 12,000 stores across the country. We're in places everywhere from Rite Aid, CVS, Walgreens to Sprouts, Nordstrom, Neiman Marcus, Urban Outfitters. So it's been a really wild ride. Thought we were going to start as more of a tech-leaning D2C business, and then just ended up having a lot of traction on the actual CPG brick and mortar side. So I admittedly am not as much of a tech business anymore, and so my approach to fundraising has changed as I went from thinking we were D2C to becoming more brick and mortar. So if anyone has any questions about that, I'm here and just excited to be here.
That's awesome, Kerrigan. Thanks for sharing. Excited to hear how that story played out as your company grew. And then Carolyn?
Hi, everyone. I'm Carolyn Witte. I'm the co-founder and CEO of TIA. We are a next-gen women's healthcare platform, reinventing really everything that you can think about with respect to how you find, access, and experience women's healthcare on the internet and in the real world. So that means we build real-world doctor's offices, with bricks and mortar and walls, build digital products for patients and providers, and have a direct-to-consumer women's health community where we really work to educate women about all aspects of female health and well-being. So it's been an interesting trajectory of building the company over the last 4 years, given that TIA very much sits in actually a lot of different categories of companies from an investor perspective, direct-to-consumer, content, community, tech, and healthcare services. And we closed our Series A financing about 9 months ago. So a lot to share there with respect to the journey of building a complex business.
That's really, really exciting. I also just caught up with the chat, and it looks like we're also getting people not only from different stages of raising, but all over the world. So welcome, everyone. Really, really exciting to have everyone here. So to kick things off, I wanted to kind of touch on the early stages, just throw us way back, at least for some of us. So how did you each tackle fundraising in the early stages of your startups? And then we'll go into a little bit of how that changed with Series A. And I'll kick it off to Kerrigan to start us off there.
So as I mentioned, no one had heard of CBD when we started in 2015. And even though I would have loved to raise money at that point, it was just initial conversations I had made it obvious that it was going to be a really hard sell, because people had not only not heard of it, but they also, as soon as they heard the word cannabis, got scared that we were trying to sell them something illegal. So in those early days, my co-founder and I each invested $15,000 of our savings into the business, which in retrospect was, you know, a tiny sum to start a business, but it was enough. We got a single product off the ground. We got a website on Shopify, and yeah, so with that $30,000, we were able to actually get proof of concept. So that we didn't take salaries. I mean, there were a lot of things that we had to sacrifice in those early days, and we did not do things the way that I would have wanted to. Like the website, you know, in retrospect, I'm embarrassed of it. The product branding was not anywhere close to what I wanted it to be. But we were able to show that there were people who wanted the product. We were able to show that retention was really good on the website, and we were able to start getting ourselves into some brick and mortar doors, and all of that led to cash flow. So by the time we turned the $30,000 into $500,000, we had a much better story to tell to investors. So our first round of capital was actually a year and a half into the business. And by the point that we started talking to investors that second time around, we could say, you know, we've turned $30,000 into $500,000. Here are the type of people that are using our products. Here are, you know, some of the metrics that we're really proud of. And those early investors were often friends and family. So people that just were willing to give us, you know, we didn't even have a minimum check size because we just were willing to take whatever capital people were willing to give us. And I think we raised about $700,000 through just mostly networking, angel investors, friends and family. And then by the end of the raise, had finally started to plug into the seed stage community here in LA. And we got our first couple institutional investors like at the caboose of the round. So I think that's like a general theme of fundraising, which is that it's much easier to raise once you already have money in the door. It's like one of those awful ironies. And so our, you know, the first 500,000 was incredibly difficult. And then the second 500,000 was much easier. So that was our seed round. And then we have done a series seed round and a bridge round. The series seed round you could consider an A, although we don't call it that. So I'll talk about that at some point, I'm sure, later in the conversation. But what you call a round actually does matter, and it can actually help you to raise money. So I'll pause and I'll let Caroline give her answer, but I'll make sure to return to some of those topics later.
That's great, thank you. And Carolyn, yeah, go for it.
So I started TIA, kind of jumped, skydived, I guess they say, into startup world. You know, quit my job, was very bullish on the concept of reimagining women's health, and kind of applying a playbook from my prior life. I worked at Google before this and into women's healthcare, but definitely didn't, I was maybe more confident than I should have been, and wasn't overly worried about the fundraising thing at the time, which is kind of, is interesting to think about in retrospect, given like, I think where I am now, I don't know if I would have been as confident, but really just dove in and started working on the idea myself. And I do think I spent about 9 months like exploring the idea before even thinking about fundraising at all, which I would encourage people to do. One of the things that I think what's exciting, there's more money going to female founders, not enough, but more. But I do think there is a kind of sometimes an over obsession with the fundraising process versus finding product market fit. And ultimately, when I did raise our first seed round, we still raised too early. We raised a $2.5 million, series seed. And it was, 4 minute, there was the board and the lawyers and like the documents and all this stuff. And off of our it was about 90 days after launching our first product, which was a direct to consumer women's health app that was kind of like a personalized WebMD for women's health. And I really do think we raised that from an investor perspective at the right time, in that we had about 3 months of data and everything was like going up and to the right. So there's always this delicate balance of having enough data, but not too much data to tell a good story. And I think we had that. It was growing really, really fast. And we had this brand that people were really excited about and all of that. did not have a business model at all. And pitched a business model. It was a marketplace model at the time, and got $2.5 million for it. And I'm making it sound easier than it was. It wasn't easy, but it actually, in retrospect, was our easiest round to raise. Like, I thought it was hard at the time, but it was the easiest money we ever raised. And was really excited, took that money, and 90 days after we closed our Series Seed round, kind of had an aha moment and was like, this is not the business that we should be building at all. We should become a doctor's office and do something that is not only like so much more complicated, but so much more expensive. And $2.5 million that I thought was a lot of money 6 weeks ago is actually not enough money anymore. And that's a painful realization to have, truthfully, as a founder, because you've sold a part of your business, you've taken money from investors who think you're building one thing and then you want to build another thing. And people like to think that everyone's pivoting at this stage, but it's actually a harder conversation to have than you might expect. And Tia's, come out of the other side stronger for it. But I do think it kind of, my learning there is taking money when you really know that your business is working, if you can afford to do that, which is a hard thing, and have our conviction around product market fit, or at least your business model and the sort of core fundamentals, I would encourage more people to do, and especially women who tend to sell more of their companies than men, which we can come back to later. And I just think there is so much excitement around raising that first round that it can sometimes come at the expense of actually figuring out what your product is. And ideally, you really figure that out first and then take money second. So after that first seed round, we had some difficult conversations with our investors when we told them we wanted to use those $2.5 million to open up a doctor's office and rebuild it in New York City, and that we were going to have to go raise more money to actually do what we wanted to do. And so we effectively pivoted the business pretty significantly, and tried to use that money that we had raised to get as far along as possible to the next chapter as we could. But we knew the whole time that it wasn't going to be enough to actually open our doors and start operating and have data on the real business that we were building. So we raised a bridge round. We raised a $3.5 million bridge round, and fortunately, were brought in investors that complemented the initial group of investors at a very different background. So I think finding investors that are true, that can actually be very value add in those early stages, are really important to the complexity of particularly if you have a very complex business like Tia. And so we brought more investors in that have more of a healthcare services and healthcare background to really complement the consumer tech investors we brought in the beginning. Zooming out to where we are today, it's kind of amazing because we have this kind of diverse cap table with investors of a lot of different experiences. And Tia, as I mentioned in the beginning, touches a lot of different categories, from consumer tech to healthcare services. And so, where we are today, I'm really excited. I'm really happy about how we got here, but it was definitely a roller coaster. And from there, it took us about 18 months, 15 to 18 months after that to get to the point where we were really had enough data on the new business, the real business that we were building, and we're going to prepare to scale to ultimately raise what ended up being a very successful Series A.
That's awesome. Thanks so much for sharing. And two things that you both shared, and I've experienced, and many founders have experienced, is that, and I think a founder who just raised, I think their valuation at $300 million was telling me about their early days and said, if you're not embarrassed by or kind of change a little bit by that first product, then you're doing it wrong. So it's it seems like it's the journey that a founder goes through, not only realizing, oh no, I've been building this for such a long time, but I should actually be building this, or, oh goodness, this isn't ready, but let's just put it out there. So really, really great. And I love that you both touched on those early stages, because those early stages really also set people up for what those late stages of fundraising look like. And it sounds like both you, Kerrigan, and Carolyn touched on the fact that even after your seed and maybe your friends and family around, you also touched on bridge before even going into the Series A. So just transitioning into how you thought about being ready for a Series A, what were some things that you considered and that made you realize that, what, we're ready for a Series A? And you can touch on if it's product, sales, metrics, and sometimes it's just money too. Even so, I'd love to kind of get that perspective. So Kerrigan, if you want to kick us off in that, in that question.
Yeah, so it's definitely product market fit. I don't think that you can raise a Series A if you haven't figured out exactly who your consumer is and why you are differentiated in the market. Admittedly, for us, it has been just sort of a bit of semantics. Like our Series Seed was much larger, than our seed round, the bridge round that we raised earlier this year. Why I called it a bridge is because it was from all existing investors who just wanted to top up, while we were going through COVID and not wanting to set out to raise a really formal, even larger round than before. So I want to go back to, why it matters what we call these rounds. I think that today in fundraising, there's been a lot of stalling, and what would have been considered a Series A before is now, a bridge, or now a Series Seed. And I think it's actually helpful to actually Carolyn might disagree with me on this one. I've found it to be helpful to get to raise some intermediate rounds before calling something, a Series A, because I think as soon as you call something a Series A, someone's going to expect a board seat, and they want to control, at least 20% of the company. And whereas if it's something like a Series Seed or a bridge, for whatever reason, even if you're still raising millions of dollars, there isn't the same formality around it. Now, the exception to that is if you get in a really institutional investor. So Lightspeed Ventures is our largest investor, and they're blue chip Silicon Valley. They want control anyway, and so whether you call it a Series Seed or a Series A, they're still going to want a lot of rights. So doesn't really matter what you call it with an investor like that. But with most investors, they are going to actually expect less. And for the most recent bridge that we raised, for example, like there were really no additional rights that we gave away. It was purely just giving away a little bit of extra equity. So yeah, Carolyn, I'm curious to know if you agree with me on that, because I know you've said you think women give away more of their companies than men. So maybe you have a different opinion than I do.
Yeah, I don't know the stat off the top of my head, but I think most companies raise 2 seed rounds now, or whatever you want to call, whatever word you want to use. The line for Series A is definitely moving and has been moving for a long time. Whether depending on, what kind of industry you're in, or if you're, SaaS or, consumer tech or healthcare services, that line is different, right? But I think that is a reality of these all was a Series A. Like we raised a $25 million Series A. That's like it was a Series B 2 years ago. So I think all these names like mean very different things and aren't that important, except one thing is really important, which is every time you raise a round, regardless of a name, it has implications for how much of the company you're selling, and bridge rounds included. And sometimes if you do like an open note or safe in between, you can help to, continually increase the cap or your valuation and mitigate dilution. But even if you don't call it a Series Seed, you may still be selling 20 to 30% of your company in a bridge round. And then you just have to know that when you get to that Series A, you should expect to sell 20 to 30% of your company. And so I think that's the thing that no one told me. And I didn't really think enough about, and was just like, I need more money to keep going and I should take it when I can get it, rather than thinking about the time between rounds, and how to be strategic about, I think sometimes raising more money, but raising that in fewer instances can help mitigate that dilution that I think, particularly with female founders who some might say have to prove more to get to different benchmarks like a Series A, sort of mitigate that dilution that comes with that.
Wow,
I
thank you.
definitely agree. Like when given the opportunity to raise more, As I said, it's always easiest at the end of the round to raise. And I've had a couple conversations with founders recently where they're like, well, we already, hit the cap to what we wanted to raise. And I'm like, don't worry about it. Like the extra money, you will use it.
I agree with that wholeheartedly.
Take it if it's offered to you.
Yep, I certainly do too, even when we're in our seed round. And to that point, I saw a lot of questions from our attendees were very much around like your KPIs and also the metrics that you were just thinking about when you were going into, not only if you even want to touch on bridge, because maybe some people in the room today are thinking, you know what, maybe I should go back and consider a bridge rather than going straight to a Series A based on what they learned today. But what are some metrics that you kept top of mind when you were going into either, for you, Carolyn, you've already done the Series A or Series A. For Kerrigan, if you go into this kind of that bridge and then now you're gearing up or in your Series A, what are those metrics that you're paying attention to? So I'll start with Carolyn for this question.
Sure. So I think the most important thing here is to self-categorize your company, if that's the right word, or put yourself into the right category and then figure out what those metrics are. So the metrics for a SaaS business for a CPG product versus a service versus healthcare are very, very different. And so revenue targets may be everything, or sort of MRRs. I saw someone in the chat, let's say not targets hit, right? Maybe everything for one business, but like really irrelevant for another business. And so understanding how to categorize yourself is really important. I want to like kind of hone in on categorizing yourself, because if you don't do it, someone else is going to do it for you. And that's really where the problems come into play, is when an investor puts you into a category that you don't see yourself in. And next thing you know, benchmarks and metrics are being applied to your business that don't ladder up with what you think matter. And so suddenly, does product market fit? Like, have you achieved product market fit? If your definition of that is not the same as the investor set you're talking to, you're going to have problems. And so I think it's really important for founders to drive that narrative and say, these are the metrics that matter for our business, and here's why. And you should think about my company as, XYZ. And so I think just to give some examples there, Tia struggled with that a little bit. I felt we had hit it out of the park with respect to every single metric that I thought mattered the most. Like all the metrics that I told our seed investors we were going to go hit, we hit and killed it. And we crossed the goal line. But telling that story to the Series A investor was quite different than the seed stage investor. And because Tia kind of is at the intersection of a lot of different sectors, from consumer tech to services, different investors were looking at different data or applying their own metric set to evaluate our company. And it caused a lot of confusion for me. And so I think figuring out how you categorize yourself put yourself in the right category, identify those metrics that matter for your business, and then take those two things and put that together into a narrative that you're going to tell to the market is really, really critical to raising a successful Series A and then ultimately driving the valuation that you deserve.
That's awesome. Thanks, Carolyn. And Kerrigan, you want to touch on that question?
Yeah, I totally agree. And as I was mentioning earlier, we raised our first round of capital, about half of our revenue was coming from D2C versus brick and mortar. And so we kind of had to be good at a lot of things at that point. Investors were digging into everything from our retention to our LTV to CAC to, the really typical D2C type metrics. How long are people spending on your site? Like, how many email subscribers do you have? What's your social media engagement like? How many followers do you have? As well as, what's your product gross margin? Wanting to make sure that the margins were healthy on our product. No one really asked in those early days about profitability. It was really, really about just top line growth. As we've transitioned more into a brick and mortar, typical CPG business, getting fewer questions about our online metrics, even though they're still important. But, you know, more so like, what kind of trade are you spending in store? And even though we're still not at a stage where we need to be profitable, wanting to understand how we plan to get to profitability. So it's evolved, but I agree with Carolyn that like my metrics that I'm following might not be relevant at all to you. So it matters most what is important for your specific category.
That's awesome. And thank you. And from what I at least gathered from there, the most important thing is drive that conversation, because if you're not driving or at the helm of that, people may miscategorize or put you in the wrong place. So that's really important, understanding your space and what metrics really matter for your space. And I think all three of us are in different spaces, and those metrics are definitely going to be different as we talk to investors. So just switching the conversation a little bit more into like, when you're thinking about the relationship that you're building or finding, and I'm going to use the word courting investors in the Series A versus your seed, what seed or even bridge, because it sounds like a lot of your bridge came from investors that are already existing. How did you think about that relationship and courting investors when you're thinking about the Series A stage versus early stages? And also, it looks like other different numbers than your seed stage became more important. So would love for either of you to touch on that piece. Kerrigan.
I can, yeah. I mean, I think relationship building is really one of the most critical things you need to do as a founder or CEO. And I'm lucky in that I have a co-founder, and she actually prefers to be more internal facing, which allows me to be more external facing. But I consider it a really important part of my job to constantly be meeting with other founders, other investors, even if we're not raising. And so I almost consider it to be full-time even when I'm not actively raising, because it's so much easier to raise money from an investor that you've already developed a relationship with. And so I have created an email distribution list, and every quarter I create an update for our investors, and then I create a separate one for prospective investors, and it contains a lot less information, a lot less detailed information, so just like broadly, we grew X percent, or here are some exciting things that happened for our business this quarter. But I find that that's a really easy way to keep track of all the people that I've met. I also have a really detailed spreadsheet that contains every single investor I've ever talked to, and it's classified by, is it a VC? Is it a private equity? Is it a family office? But I think that the most important thing to do is to figure out quickly what kind of investor is going to be interested in your raise. So if we're talking about Series A, like almost guaranteed that's not going to be a private equity firm. Don't waste time talking to private equity. It could be VC, it could be high net worth individuals, although they might write smaller checks than a venture capital fund. But it definitely will save you some time to cross out of the list, like, okay, don't talk to private equity, because all the sad truth is every investor will take a call with you because it's their job to traffic in information. So they will spend an hour with you and maybe even more because they just want to learn about CBD, or they want to tell their friends that they talked to you, or whatever it is. So getting to that no quickly is important. And then I always ask at the end of a conversation, like, is there someone else that you would recommend I talk to? And it's amazing how often it actually leads to a new conversation.
Thank you. And Carolyn, I don't know if you want to touch on that as well in regards to, and you've raised your Series A. So what did that process look like getting into doors in Series A raise versus seed round? How much did you lean on your earlier investors versus build new relationships? Would love to hear about that experience.
It was a bit of both. ultimately our Series A lead was a direct intro from a seed investor who had a close relationship, and they'd been on the boards of healthcare companies together. And it was not just like an intro, it was like a trusted kind of, I believe, so you should believe too type of relationship that I think was really critical. But that was kind of a unique experience, I would say. It was a mix of, I think, I really used my seed investors as a way to vet who I should spend time with and who would be a waste of time. So sometimes they made, we'd go through like our investor tracker together and talk about, they're not going to be into this because of X, Y, Z, or they're going to waste your time, or these are going to be the key concerns, or that sort of thing. And who's the best intro kind of across our investor set. I think that was particularly helpful. But just to reiterate what Kerrigan said, I think most people will, like, getting a meeting isn't a hard thing. Typically, people will really waste your time. But I think one thing going back to like the category issue I was talking about before, is going in the right door, like at a fund, is really important, whether it's at the right level, and having someone senior enough, paying attention early on. Any associate will probably talk to you. But like, if they don't have any sway, you can get mixed signals. And so I think I'd be wary of that. But also not be, too cocky where you're not going to talk to someone that's not a partner. It's a delicate balance. And then I think secondarily, at the bigger funds that maybe cross industry, really thinking of, if you're the company that lives in consumer tech, but also services or whatever it is, figuring out which are the teams or the investors within a firm that most align with your thesis in your business. Because if you go through the wrong doorway to get into the firm, and the deal gets killed, and then you actually think someone else can be your champion, it's kind of too late. And so I think that's like a harder thing to figure out, that you should really do your research on the internet and getting to know people. But I also think leaning on your investor set to say, I really love the GV team, who's the right person or group within GV that would most resonate with what we're doing, that you think would be the right angle. I think we don't spend enough time on those conversations. It's typically more at the firm level.
That's awesome. Thanks so much for sharing. Even for 5 to 9, we're definitely leaning a lot on current investors to help us navigate conversations as we go into a Series A investors for our next round. So thank you so much for sharing your experience, Carol. And then Kerrigan, as you answer that question as well, in regards to how you've also navigated, one of the things is we're in a pandemic. I know, Carolyn, you finished yours right before the craziness happened. And I bet that's also presented its own challenges for your business as you go into fulfilling some things in after the round. But Kerrigan, I'd love for you to touch on how have you also navigated that in a pandemic. A lot of times it's like you travel to the coast, meet the investors, go to happy hours, networking hours, all those good things to get in front of those associates and all of that. But how have you navigated these conversations in a pandemic, which we're probably going to be in for a little bit longer?
Yeah, I would say that's actually one of the few things that hasn't been disrupted by COVID. It's been very easy to get a hold of people. Everyone's at home and they're not traveling. And so I'm finding that I'm not having to schedule conversations out as far as I normally would expect to. People are usually available that same week to talk. And we're just doing it through, Zoom or Google Hangouts. So yeah, and I think that at the beginning of COVID, investors were talking about, being nervous about not being able to meet in person, and that was typically a part of their due diligence process. But I don't think that that's really turned into a concern. I think that the harder thing is just that we can't predict when COVID is going to end, and it has affected our business. We're sold in brick and mortar, and people are not, shopping as much in store. And if they are, they're spending less time in store. And so the harder thing is having to explain how we think we can actually take control over our performance, and not actually be at the whim of when the vaccine is rolled out. And so a lot of what I'm talking about right now is all of the ways in which we can affect our growth this year, whether or not the vaccine is rolled out, by summer or by the end of the year. So yeah, taking control has been a big part of my narrative, because I think that the truth is that no one had control. There have been some businesses that have really benefited from the COVID virus, other people that have had a lot of issues because of COVID, and some investors are going to want, growth at all costs, and they don't care that there's a pandemic. And others are going to say, oh, this is a great time for us to actually maybe invest at a better value than we would have. That's another way I would say you should try to get an early no in the conversation, because there are some investors that have very specific hurdles. I was told at one point that, most VCs will not look at a business that has not grown 300% over year. That was from one of our own investors in VC. I don't know how true that is, but you want to know that, like, within the first conversation. If you haven't met a metric that they care about, or for example, if an investor is not okay with investing in cannabis, I want to know that in the first conversation so that I don't waste my time.
Yeah. And I think a popular thing I'm hearing here is guard your time, especially in those first conversations. Make sure you have all your questions answered. And one thing someone had told me a while back in terms of ending conversations is like, is there a question that I should be asking you that I didn't ask you? Which forces the other person to kind of start thinking about, oh yeah, maybe like you didn't ask me if I'm in your category. That's important to know. So those are really, really good insights. And thank you so much. And so going into the kind of last piece of this is thinking about when you first got your formal offer. And I'll start with Carolyn for this question. What aspects of your term sheet required the most negotiation and or attention when you were kind of having those first conversations or got your formal offers?
Yeah, so we had a kind of a whirlwind experience raising a Series A. And it's like, it feels like a slog. And then suddenly you get a term sheet, and then you get another one and another one. And like, suddenly you have leverage and the tables turn, and it's, you have too much money. And then you're like, should I take more? And it's a crazy sequence of events that can happen really, really quickly. And based off of, I think my biggest learning is like some things that you control, which is, your pitch and your business and hitting out of the park, and other things that you don't control, which are things that happen in the world and the market that, can change everything from how much money you can raise to the valuation. And Tia kind of, this journey is a byproduct of a combination of those things in many ways. I think what it's helpful to like prepare for that, because suddenly when the tables do turn, you feel like you have, you're the one selling and you have no power or leverage. And then suddenly you do, and you're kind of caught off guard and like, what should I be negotiating for? And so for us, there was a big question around how much money were we going to raise, ultimately take, and the size of the round significantly. It had doubled in like 4 weeks. And then COVID happened. Like, it's crazy to think that we almost raised half of what we raised. I can't fathom it. And we almost did that, and it completely changed in 4 weeks. I think what can be really hard is like pro rata conversations. So as Kerrigan pointed out, no one wants to give you money, and then everybody wants to give you money. And so people hedge, and then suddenly you have a term sheet and everyone wants in, and then it can be difficult to have those conversations around who you're going to make space for. And that's I think a challenging relationship thing that I wasn't really prepared for, but kind of understanding your own values there is an important thing to think about ahead of time. And then things like board seats and, voting rights in construction and all of that. And we spent a lot of time. We didn't really have a formal board that we use very effectively, let's say, before our Series A, and I'm really, really excited and happy with the way our board turned out. It's an all-female board, which is pretty amazing and rare. And making a board something that's useful to you as a founder and not like this annoying thing is really, really important. And so that was like a core component of kind of the negotiation as well. So ultimately, I think you get into this world of like, should I be optimizing for, you know, less dilution in 1% here, 0.5% there. And the end of the day, like it's, you know, on the one hand, I was saying earlier, you know, you should be very dilution conscious. And I don't think I spend enough time thinking about that. On the other hand, I think you need to pick up your head and look at, you know, see the forest for the trees and not over negotiate about, you know, relatively small things in the scheme of building a company, and optimize instead for ensuring that you're bringing the right people in to help you build your company. So if you like over optimize for price or dilution or something like that at the expense of people and partnerships, I think you'll really regret it. And so that's really it can be hard when you're like in it to remember that, but you are selling a large part of your company, oftentimes giving up a lot more control and making sure it's a marriage and that these are people you want to work with and people that you want to be in your corner on good and bad days is the most important thing. And if that means you just sell slightly more of your company to do that, to have the good people in your corner, I would recommend everybody do that.
Thank you so much for sharing. And Kerrigan, I'd love for you to share a little bit about that as well. And just to reframe, basically what happened after you got those formal letters. How did you kind of approach those negotiation conversations with your investors?
Yeah, it's really interesting. Once you get a term sheet, the whole process changes. So like Carolyn said, having leverage in this process is everything. Interestingly, it can backfire. We had a situation where we had multiple term sheets and one investor ended up actually getting like annoyed that we told them we had another term sheet, which I don't think is typically the case. I think typically investors have FOMO, but it has to be some awareness that these people often have egos. And so if you don't, you need to stroke them a little bit, even if you're telling them that, you know, you have another offer, like you still need to make it clear that, you know, they're someone that you want to work with, because if you don't, they will feel turned off. So there is still a delicate dance. Although to Carolyn's point, like maybe that wasn't someone we wanted to work with if they had such gentle or delicate egos. But the one thing I do want to add is having a corporate lawyer that you trust is really important. We switched before we did our Series Seed and to a much more expensive firm. I don't actually know in retrospect if that was the right decision, because we ended up feeling so nervous about talking to them because it was like over $1,000 an hour every time, you know, we wanted to ask a question. And the thing is, you don't want to get cheap about that, because they are one of the best sources of advice during a fundraise process. What I would recommend is that you have them actually walk you through a scenario of like different waterfall scenarios, but not just in a spreadsheet. Like have them actually walk you through, okay, so let's say we take this deal and tomorrow we get an offer for $100 million to buy the company. Like what rights does this investor have to block the transaction? What's their pro rata, i.e. how much are they going to get to take off the top before we see a dollar? And do that for all of your investors, because we have signed a term sheet, which, you know, we've had now a couple of acquisition offers. And as we've gone through the math, we're like, oh, you know, we didn't really realize that would have been the case. Like with this one offer that we got, it was like, not only could our investor, you know, block this transaction, but also they would have taken every single dollar of cash that we were offered. And so I'm not saying like every investor is looking to take advantage of you, but their lawyers are really sophisticated. And I just don't think we asked enough questions of our corporate attorney. So yeah, ask a lot of questions. And if you're in the situation that we were, where you're like feeling cheap and afraid to talk to the lawyer because you don't want to spend the money, like you should probably just switch lawyers so that you feel like you can actually use their counsel.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And we're actually going into a little bit of Q&A, but I think, Carolyn, you've been doing such a great job of responding to some questions in the chat as well as the Q&A. So thank you so much for that. And before we jump into Q&A, if anyone has questions, please feel free to chat, to add them to the Q&A part of the Zoom, and I would love to direct them over. Just wanted to ask you both, kind of what's one piece of advice that you'd like to give to founders when they're thinking about raising money, if there's one thing you would leave everyone with. And I'll start with Carolyn for this question, and then Kerrigan.
One thing I would leave founders. Okay, can I cheat and give two? Two things.
All the advice, we're here for it.
So first is remember a very simple thing. Remember that building a business is about people. At the end of the day, founders are people, investors are people, your employees are people, and optimizing for people and is the most important thing you can do to make a really difficult thing enjoyable and worthwhile. So that's the most important, and being very selective around who you want with you on the ride. And then the second is, particularly in the early stages, remember that investment is just a function, like just like a tool to help you grow your product and business. It's not, doesn't make, or it enables a company, it doesn't make a company. And what makes a company is your product. So obsession with product and your customer is more important than fundraising. You need to fundraise to keep your product, enable your product to grow for most businesses, but don't let that come at the expense of focus on your product.
Yeah, Kerrigan, what are one or two pieces of advice you'd like to give our founders today before we are off?
I would say that this is a process that requires high touch. So I mentioned earlier the quarterly updates that I send to our investors as well as prospective investors. And there was a quarter in which I sent our existing investors, I think at the bottom of the update, it said, we're thinking about starting to raise our Series A. Like, if anyone is interested in participating or has someone we should talk to, please reach out to me. Didn't hear anything. And, I could see from Klaviyo that, per usual, most of our investors read the update. So I was feeling a little bit annoyed. And then I just started like one-off emailing investors. Hey, wanted to catch up. Don't know if you saw my note. We're thinking about raising our Series A. Would love to catch up. And the response was just night and day. Like, oh yeah, I'd love to participate. Let me know when the terms are set. Or yeah, I have, particularly from some of our institutional investors, I have 10 people you should talk to. Or as Carolyn mentioned earlier, like, let's go through your investor list. Let's make sure that you have intros to all the people that you want. So I wouldn't rely on, like, this is something that you do need to ask for help. And the best way to do that is to do that personally. And I think people in general really want to be helpful. So go that extra step of making a phone call or sending a personalized email.
Thank you. Thank you. And the last question, while I'm asking and they're responding, I'd love to just hear from the people who are on the call today. I'd love to hear what everyone learned from our conversation today. So just add it in the chat, just hearing what some things people are reading, what some people have learned from this. But the next question for Kerrigan and Carolyn is, what's next for each of you in regards to what are y'all doing right now? What's next? Carolyn, you can feel free to go first there.
Yeah, I can start. So we closed our Series A on March 17th, which is the day before shelter in place went into effect in New York City, where is where we operate and deliver healthcare services, and the world imploded. So it's been a crazy, crazy journey. And our 2020 growth was slowed as a result of COVID. But we've also evolved the business in really remarkable ways that make our business and product stronger coming out of COVID than it was than it was before. And so the investment thesis has changed a bit, but it's stronger. So with that, this year, we're really excited to know exactly where we're going and what we need to do and why, and growing a ton and executing. And so it's going to be a big year for growth for TIA in the lead up to our Series B.
Thank you. So exciting. Kerrigan?
Yeah, for us, it's actually continuing to launch into new stores. So we'll be available in a few thousand additional stores by the end of Q1. But taking a closer look at, what those various stores are actually doing to our business. So, in the early days, it was sort of like, let's go wherever they want us. And now, examining, like, is this a profitable store? To that end, gearing up to launch on Amazon, which is exciting, given that CBD as a category is not really allowed on Amazon. So we're being creative on how to do that, as well as just putting more focus into our D2C business. So after, the last couple of years of really growing in brick and mortar, recognizing that in a COVID and post-COVID world, like, it's still important to pay attention to our site, has definitely shifted priorities for the organization. So yeah, I'm excited. This year has been just really, really hard, but it's also, I think, forced us to look at how to grow the business the right way and not just, growth for growth's sake.
Thank you so much. You both were and continue to be amazing. So I appreciate you all giving just all your feedback and input. And with that, I'll pass it on to Marian to close us off, but really appreciate the audience for listening, asking amazing questions, our panelists for sharing their story and inspiring all of us who are definitely about to start embarking on exactly what they're doing in the coming year or so. So really excited and appreciate everyone for being here today.
Yes, thank you so much. It's so funny. I've done a few Raising Series A events, and it's always great to continue learning perspectives, insights, and journeys. Learned a lot today. Was not expecting that, the corporate lawyer piece. And so it's just really great that you were both vulnerable and sharing the ups and downs of the journey. And it's definitely, there's no journey alike. So really appreciate the insights. I've just been watching the chat, and so love to see how everyone has been so active. Just a couple closing things. We will be sending out a SurveyMonkey email. So if you could all just please give us your feedback, let us know what you liked, what you learned. We're always looking to improve and continue to have amazing founders to share their stories, the tribulations and the successes as well. So thank you again to all of you in the audience, and especially our speakers today. Denise, great job moderating, love the vibe, great questions, and just looking forward to kind of seeing where your company's going following all the growth that you do. I will leave the chat open for a little bit. I know some people were asking how they can connect with the speakers. If you all would like to kind of chat there, drop ways to connect if you're interested, LinkedIn's. I would definitely, say that's a great way to connect with our speakers. But with that, thank you again, everyone, for your time and all of your great tips and advice. Appreciate it, and stay safe. And looking forward to the post-COVID era. All right, take care, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Marian.
Thank you.